Good morning, Creative Time Summit. My name is Neil Brenner. I'm not an artist. I'm a professor. I teach urban theory at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And I'm really delighted to be here. I'm delighted that Creative Time is engaging with questions of place and cultural production. So that is actually the question that I want to pose in my opening remarks this morning. Can place be a productive basing point for a politics of social justice in the world today? So I want to start by situating my analysis in relation to different trends that are happening in capitalism and the modern state. We live in a time of global economic crisis. So the Great Recession of 2008 and subsequently is really only the most recent in a wave of economic crises, kinds of cycles of booms and busts that have been destabilizing the world economy for quite some time now. And the consequence of this has been really quite devastating for people all over the world. So we're seeing new forms of polarization, precariousness, and social suffering. So suffering not simply as a dimension of individual misfortune, but suffering as something that's directly conditioned by broader structures of political economic inequality and power. The dominant response to this situation in contemporary capitalism has been basically market fundamentalism, a politics of austerity, which I view as a form of corporate welfare which actually insulates large corporations from market forces while subjecting the rest of the population even more directly to the forces of marketization. And another aspect of austerity is that it's an incredibly depoliticizing approach to the economy. It tries to convince us in that old Thatcherite dictum that there is no alternative but to cut back on social protections and social redistribution. So this situation has major consequences for places all over the world. And the radical geographer Neil Smith some years ago coined the term urban revanchism to describe the new forms of cities and the new forms of placemaking that are emerging under these conditions of neoliberal capitalism. And its key elements are incredibly exclusionary for people who live in cities. Privatization, gentrification, exclusion, and polarization. So essentially, under this regime of urban revanchism, you have state institutions being mobilized instead of supporting the most marginalized or vulnerable populations. They're being mobilized in ways that actively intensify exclusion and marginalization and polarization. So for Smith, Giuliani's New York City was the paradigm of this urban revanchism, but arguably different forms of urban revanchism have been proliferating all over the world under conditions of neoliberal capitalism. So this is obviously problematic stuff for those of us on the left, but it's even more problematic because it's hard to even recognize these processes of exclusion going on through the ideological mist that pervades contemporary urban policy discourse. So notions of growth and development and regeneration present places as simply sites that can be manipulated and economic development can be promoted as a kind of natural process. And such discourses hide the power relations and the exclusionary processes that underpin the production of place and which are obviously of central concern to us in a conference like this. Particularly disturbing here, and Nato already alluded to this, is the ways in which the discourse of creativity in the contemporary context is being mobilized as a kind of new urban ideology, promoting different kinds of local growth and gentrification and polarization. So effectively, culture and the arts being instrumentalized as part of a local growth machine project. And obviously, this is very much at odds with the agendas that we have in a conference like this around empowerment, inclusion, and democracy. So in a way, I want to frame this just by pointing out the ways in which cultural production, so our concern in this conference is really right in this contradictory spot. On the one hand, being mobilized in ways that promote exclusion and gentrification, but on the other hand, it also, we believe, has potential for promoting a very different world based on social justice and democracy. So this is the question that I want to suggest we need to grapple with in the context of these broader processes of global economic crisis and political austerity. Can placemaking be a viable basing point for promoting social justice under these conditions? So obviously, when we occupy a place, we have the opportunity to experiment and maybe even to implement radical alternatives. So there's something very powerful there which I think we need to grapple with. But at the same time, the broader structures of power in the world of neoliberal capitalism are very large scale, and the question is whether placemaking can be a basis for an adequate response to those particular processes in a situation of global neoliberal urbanization. So the question that I think we need to wrestle with is basically this: is placemaking a weapon for social justice and for promoting radical democracy, or is it a trap? I mean, clearly it's both. And part of what I want to discuss here is the ways in which placemaking is embedded in this contradictory situation between potential but also certain kinds of vulnerabilities that I want to argue we absolutely need to be aware of. So one way to begin thinking about this, it seems to me, is by considering the ways in which place is instrumentalized by capital to promote profit making. So at core, capital is a process of circulation. It involves combining labor power, raw materials, and money in pursuit of a profit, in pursuit of the surplus, which is continually reinvested in pursuit of more and more surplus. But capital is not only flow. Capital involves a moment of fixity. In order to make a profit, capital has to embed itself within the landscape, within the built environment of the world, in order to combine with labor power and with local conditions in order to generate that surplus. So the interplay between the fixing of investment within the landscape and the circulation in pursuit of profits is at the heart of capitalism, and it's arguably underpinned the production of urban landscapes for the last 150 to 200 years, from the industrial cities of the 19th century to the global cities of the present period, from the large-scale metropolitan regions that expanded after World War II around the world, including right here in New York City, all the way up through very large-scale urbanizing regions in East Asia. This is an image of the Pearl River Delta, all the way up to the world scale. So clearly, capital is imprinting itself upon the places that we live in. But by the same token, it's clear that places are not only the products of capital. Places are realms in which people struggle to survive and to produce an everyday life for themselves. And it's a realm in which people also articulate radically opposed visions of what a place could be that are at odds with simply the idea of using a place to maximize profits. So how do we make sense of places against the rule of capital? And NATO alluded to this as well, the Henri Lefebvre idea of the right to the city, a wonderful, very imaginative radical spatial theorist in the 1960s who wrote this book called The Right to the City, which it seems to me provides a way to think about a counter-politics of place opposed to the rule of capital. As I read the concept, the core idea is democratize places. The radicalism of the Lefebvre idea, from my point of view, is that it's a double-edged democratization. On the one side, it's a claim to democratize access to place. So instead of producing cities of exclusion, cities of injustice, you open up the city for all, so that all people can access the cities that currently exist. But even more radically than that, Lefebvre insists that we need to democratize the power to produce place. So in a capitalist system, the power to produce place is effectively monopolized by the owners of property, the owners of the means of production, the system that controls the ways in which places are produced. So if you democratize that, if you open up the power to produce place to popular participation, radically democratic participation, you open up the possibility of producing a radically different world. So both of these elements are essential to Lefebvre's theory, and it seems to me they're central to our project here. Democratizing access to what exists, but also democratizing the capacity to produce something radically different, something radically new based on other kinds of agendas. It seems to me this kind of struggle over the right to the city has underpinned the history of capitalism for quite some time. Lefebvre himself was quite inspired by the Paris Commune of 1871. He was writing in the midst of the events of May in 1968, which was really a global protest against capitalism, against war, and so forth. And these struggles continue. So workers' struggles, this is from the coal miner strike under Thatcher, struggles not just to occupy a factory in the labor process, but to extend that into an entire territory and beyond. The anti-WTO protests, which were kind of exploded in Seattle in 1999, and which continue to this day, it was not only about occupying the space of Seattle to demonstrate, but it was also about arguing for a democratization of the power to change the world, the ways in which the contemporary rules of the world economy generate destructive social and environmental outcomes. And of course, in our own moment, the Occupy movements here in New York City and around the world are very much in that same tradition, which begin with the Paris Commune and continue up through this day, democratizing access to the urban spaces of New York City and beyond, but also trying to argue for a democratization of the power to organize the world. And this continues this is from Gezi Park in Istanbul, this continues, these struggles continue. So clearly there's a battle going on. On the one hand, capital trying to use place to fix its own circulation process, and on the other hand, people around the world trying to appropriate place to promote very different ideas. So I'm inspired, I hope it's clear, by placemaking. I'm sympathetic, and very committed to that. But what I want to do now is suggest that there are some problems. There are some vulnerabilities associated with a place-based approach to social justice. And it seems to me, given that we're committed to promoting social justice within places, we need to be attuned to what these vulnerabilities are. So in thinking about this set of issues and preparing for this presentation, I came up with 4 such problems. The first is that there's a risk that place can become an enclave. So a classic example of this would be the squatters' movements of Europe and North America. Obviously, there's a broader vision of social change embedded in housing, so housing for all. But to the degree that the project is confined to a building, it can become an enclave, and broader processes of urban redevelopment and speculation just flow around it. And an example of that, which is, I think, relevant to this discussion, is the Tacheles in Berlin, which is a wonderful building that was occupied after reunification by artists, creative producers, the alternative political scene, and which used it to stage all kinds of fascinating and inspiring events and agendas. But meanwhile, surrounding that neighborhood in Berlin, in Mitte, gentrification proceeded apace. So kind of uninterrupted, it just flows right around the Tacheles. So it becomes an enclave articulating a broader idea, but not really interrupting the broader processes of exclusionary placemaking that flowed all around it. And actually, recently, the Tacheles was bought by a real estate developer, and the artists had to leave. So that's a problem, it seems to me. But this leads to another problem, which is that to the degree that placemaking actually starts to threaten the rule of capital, there's a real danger that places can be destroyed. They can be subjected to annihilation. And we've really seen a wave of police repression against democratic demonstrations around the world in the post-9/11 era, which is incredibly disturbing for those of us committed to sort of participatory radical democracy. And that's an example of that. So, and this, of course, has a long legacy. In the Paris Commune, again, Lefebvre's key example, the demonstrators, the occupiers were slaughtered. The events of May, which Lefebvre was writing about in the 1960s, massive police violence against the students and the workers. This is from Seattle, 1999, so another more contemporary version of that. The placemaking processes begin to threaten broader power structures, and the state mobilizes full forces of repression against the demonstrators, and that, of course, continues in the contemporary moment with the dismantling of Zuccotti Park and the Occupy movement more generally, and this is also kind of a problem that it seems to me we need to deal with, the vulnerability, the question of vulnerability. But this in turn leads to a third issue, it seems to me, which is that frequently there are examples in which the radical discourses of placemakers are actually co-opted by dominant forms of power and de-radicalized. So a couple examples of that, I mean, a kind of mundane example would be Whole Foods. So the kind of discourse of localism, local food systems, which I think is incredibly radical and incredibly important, it's co-opted by a kind of large commercial distribution system, which wants to use that particular notion of local consumption, local production and consumption, but arguably that kind of scale of of food provision is at odds with a kind of localist model. But more disturbing than that, from my point of view, I mean, that's problematic, but even more disturbing examples would be the notion of the right to the city itself, which, as I tried to suggest, is really a radical bottom-up model. It's been appropriated by governments, by national governments around the world, and even by the UN as a way to frame projects that are intended to promote participation. But the question is, how can you really promote participation from above? Lefebvre himself had a concept of autogestion, self-management, radical grassroots empowerment, which is very much at odds with this particular vision. And again, closer to home, closer to our agenda in the conference, the idea of the creative city, which has been popularized by urban consultant Richard Florida, it connects with radical visions of the possibilities of creative work in cities. But they're completely co-opted and instrumentalized to promote local growth machine politics. So this would also be an example of co-optation. Local governments all over the world are consulting with Richard Florida to try to figure out their particular way of being a creative economy. So it's a very different kind of agenda than I think what we're trying to do in a conference like this. And one other vulnerability of placemaking, of radical placemaking, is that oftentimes the most socially vibrant places at a subsequent point in time get appropriated for capitalist profit-making strategies. So one example of that is the Greater London Council, which was a municipal socialist project in London in the 1980s, promoting anti-racist politics, feminist politics, a labor politics of negotiating urban and industrial restructuring. So a real experiment with localism and local economic development from below, but in a paradoxical way, that democratic socialist localism tills the soil for a reactionary neoliberal localism that was subsequently mobilized by Thatcher. She smashes the Greater London Council, and we subsequently see the development of London as a global city, and in a way the kind of localist experimentation, trying to promote a place-specific form of economic development actually makes it easier for this neoliberal project to proceed. And a second example that's very, I think, familiar to us in this room is gentrification itself. So oftentimes artists move into a kind of marginalized neighborhood and use that neighborhood as a basing point for creative energies. But the problem, of course, is that in so doing, they make the neighborhood more attractive for future real estate speculation. So we're all too familiar with this kind of example. So this is Williamsburg, where at a later point in time, real estate developers move in, capitalizing literally on the potentialities, on the energies that the artists brought. They get kicked out, and what you get are kind of large condominiums in a completely anesthetized urban environment. So this is a serious problem. So my point here is basically that place is a powerful realm and basing point for social justice projects, but it's also filled with vulnerabilities. And my goal here is simply to say that these are problems that we collectively need to wrestle with. So obviously we're wrestling with the question of how to appropriate place and mobilize place for promoting social justice and radical democracy. And I'm trying to suggest that in so doing, we'll be better positioned to do so by being aware of some of these vulnerabilities. So I don't know the solutions. It seems to me that this has to be a collective discussion. And just in closing, I'll just mention a few strategies that I think might be productive. So one strategy is, in general in life, this is a good strategy. Be dialectical. So in other words, it's filled with potential, but there are also some traps. So by being aware of that dualism, that contradictory character of place, we'll be better positioned to mobilize in place. So that would be one strategy. A second one is, in a world of market fundamentalism, asserting core values like democracy, social justice, and so forth, empowerment, is a radical move, whether with reference to cities or other sites. And so it seems to me getting clear about those values and asserting them is fundamental. And then finally, I want to suggest we need to expand our spatial imagination. So think not just about places, but about different ways of connecting places to one another and scaling up our radical imaginations beyond place. So Neil Smith called that spatial politics. And I think we need to think not just about place politics, but spatial politics. The forces at work in the world are very large scale. They're also very small scale. So we also need to think about large-scale spatial transformations, even as we struggle at the small scale. Thank you very much. I look forward to the conference.